Grüß, willkommen in einem Video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 46 of my figure gaming video series. In this video, I'll be looking at how I created my initial 6mm Napoleonic force mix, why I did it, and what was the results. From bitter experience, I've learned that when you try or decide to try a new scale and period of figure gaming, you need to do your research, otherwise things will go wrong. For my 6mm World War II force mix, I've been forced to rebase 3 times and have dramatically changed the figure type ratios to accommodate the scale and rules I end up playing the most. The result is I have a large number of figures which I will never use. My 15mm Napoleonic Prussian force mix, while not as bad, has been rebased 3 times and the figure type ratios are so out of whack there is no way I'll ever be able to field more than a fraction of my Prussian cuirassiers. My Prussian cavalry has now been allocated to new US based Austrian and British force mixes. Not ideal, but at least they'll be used, and the effort of building up my new Austrian and British force mix has been reduced. If you do not do your research up front, you will waste a large amount of time, money and effort. When I decided to build out additional force mixes for my 15mm Napoleonics, specifically a Austrian, French and British and Russian force mix, I applied this lesson and the results have been very positive. When you decide to start your research, what do you need to know up front? The first question you need to ask yourself is what period and what scale you wish to game in. If you have no figures and like a specific period in question, then that question has been answered. As for the scale question, that's harder to answer and requires more research, but assume you want a specific scale because of a good reason, then your 2 questions have been answered and you can proceed. That's the case if you don't have a force mix. On the other hand, if you already have a 15mm Napoleonic force mix, then why should you consider getting a 6mm Napoleonic force mix? In most cases, the answer will be there probably is no point. Assuming you have a 15mm force mix, you must have opponents at that scale, and you have played many games, so why try a new scale? What can you get from a 6mm Napoleonic force mix that your 15mm Napoleonic force mix is not going to give you? One possible answer is you want a brand new force mix, different nationality or whatever, and feel 6mm, for example, is cheaper and easier to paint up this new nationality force mix. Later in the video I'll discuss why this may be a wrong assumption, but from the surface, or at least initially, it seems reasonable. Another possible reason is you meet a new group of gamers which use a new scale. You may wish to join their group, which requires a new force mix, which in this case happens to be 6mm. This is one of the best reasons I can think of to move down 6mm, or the 6mm path. Another possible reason for moving to 6mm is there's something about the scale you are currently using you do not like. This normally dovetails into the rules being used, but is another valid reason. Back in the olden days, I used to use 25mm figures, but when I saw 15mm figures, I left 25mm figures and went to 15mm, even though the rules I was using was identical, WRG Napoleonics. I can't remember why I did this specifically, but there must have been a powerful driver for me to do this. In the opposite trend, I know a player who went from 15mm to 25mm because he liked specific regiments and wanted to paint up his desired regiment in 25mm because he felt it looked better, which, let's be honest, it does. However, what I've discovered is the main reason players use more than one scale for a specific period is they use different rules. Something about the rules favours a specific figure scale and basing. This tended to be the initial reason that I went down the 6mm Napoleonic force mix path. Whatever the reason for this move to 6mm, make sure you have a good reason for the period and scale that you wish to try out. The next factor to consider is the rules. Make sure you have one or more sets of rules in mind when you get your force mix. Preferably, you should have played a number of games using those rules and have decided you like them, and you know there is a gaming community you can be part of using those particular rules. The main reason why selecting rules up front is so important is this will determine how you base your figures. and may actually even determine if 6mm is a good direction to move down or not. In the 6mm world for Napoleonics, the basing seems to fall into three basic types. The 3cm square or 1-inch square, or at least 3 centimeters wide or 1 inch wide, the 4cm wide and 2 to 4 centimeters deep, and the 6cm wide with varying depth type of basing. Some of these base sizes are optimal for different scales, so 25mm will need 6cm wide bases, obviously, but strangely enough, in many cases 6mm figures also uses 6cm wide bases, and this tends to be quite popular, probably the most popular basing. 6mm figures can also use 4cm wide bases, although I've discovered this is not very common. Finally, some 6mm figures uses a 3cm square or 1 inch square, or at least a 3cm wide or 1 inch wide base. This tends to be the second most common basing for 6mm that I've come across, at least. If you currently possess 15mm Napoleonics based on 4cm wide basing, basing your 6mm figures, Napoleonic figures, on the same base size doesn't really make much sense. In this situation, you would probably base it on a 6cm wide base, or maybe, as a lesser probability, try the 3cm wide or square base path. The option I went with was 3cm square bases, with the option of using movement trays to give me 6cm wide bases. If a player wants to create mini dioramas, then a 6cm square base will give them the best solution. I decided not to go down this path and instead achieve the same effect by putting my 3cm bases together to create the dioramas, if I particularly wanted to do this. So far I haven't really done this very much, but I have used this structure for games of bitchute, which does require 6cm wide bases. In my case I use 6cm square bases or movement trays. When I decided to go down the 6mm path, the initial rules I decided to focus on was Bloody Big Battles and the Age of Eagles. I also wanted to make sure that whatever I did also accommodated bitchute and a figure game version of a SPI board game, Napoleon at War, which I call Grosse Schlachten, which ended up being the rules that I mainly use these days. But when I built my 6mm figures, I didn't really know what rules I would use the most of, so I needed to make sure I covered as many as I possibly could. All these rules do have a common theme. They're all designed to help you refight an entire battle of up to 100,000 men, if not more in some rare cases. Why did I focus on these rules? The simple answer is if you're interested in skirmish games, you are not going to be interested in 6mm. 6mm is all about recreating entire historical battles, and if you prefer to refight smaller conflicts, then other scales are better suited to that. All the rules that I've selected do support bases which are 3cm square or 1 inch square, or at least 3cm or 1 inch wide, and in some cases even 2cm square if you want to go down that path, which I did consider for a moment but rejected. The only exception is bitchute, and in that case I use movement trays. Regardless, in bitchute the figures are almost irrelevant. It's all about deploying the cards in such a manner to look good. There were other rules I was also considering: Snappy Nappy, Volume Bayonet, and Marshal of the Empire. I have no idea if these rules support the base sizes that I decided to go down, but if it does not, I have my core rules to use with 6mm, and I can bring out my 15mm figures for these other rules if required. Thus, in conclusion, before you buy any figures, try and identify some sets of rules which may be suitable and decide on some form of basing which allows you to use those rules, while also considering flexibility in case you need to move over to a new set of rules. Now let's look at one common reason players initially think about moving to 6mm: the perception the armies are cheaper and easier to paint. First, let's look at the cost. Whether you're using 15mm or 6mm, the number of elements should be similar. Let's compare the costs of a typical element in both cases, at least for infantry. A 15mm infantry element would consist of 4 figures. At Lancashire Games, a packet of 8 line infantry costs £3.75p or £1.87p per element. There are more expensive 15mm providers, but this is the range I currently use as I feel it gives me reasonable figures at a reasonable cost. For 6mm figures, a base typically requires 12 figures. There are many different basing systems. I'm just comparing what I particularly selected, which is 12 figures per base. Each player can make their own calculation using their own basing system. A packet of 96 6mm figures from Bacchus costs £6.67 if you live outside of the UK, which means each fig costs about 84p per 12 figures or element. This is a bit cheaper, but not a whole lot cheaper. Where this seeming reducing of cost myth it comes from or is lost is the number of figures. Each packet of line infantry gives me 8 elements, if you want 8 bases or not. With cavalry it's even worse. You end up with a lot of unnecessary figures when buying 6mm figures. So there is a lot more wastage when you purchase 6mm figures. And actually whatever cost saving you may have achieved, which is pretty minimal, generally is completely lost as a result. Thus, in summary, 6mm is marginally cheaper, but not as much as people may expect, and if you factor in wastage, it's the same cost. What made it worse for me was I purchased my 15mm Lancashire figures on special and end up spending less on my 15mm force mix than my 6mm force mix. The values that I've provided are the recommended retail, but Lancashire does provide specials at least twice a year, so in theory, you can actually get a cheaper solution going down 15mm if you go down that particular brand. If, on the other hand, you're using 3cm wide by 1cm deep bases and only place a single line of infantry on each base, the story is very different. The cost of your 6mm army is now about 1/3 that of your 15mm force mix. I'm increasingly coming around to this basing system as it also allows me to reduce the playing area size. I suspect the real benefit of 6mm figures is to take advantage of their size and create small elements and small playing areas. You may even be able to use a smaller base, but I think it gets a bit too fiddly then. So let's just say with 3cm. So if you're going to go down this basing, then yes, 6mm is a whole lot cheaper than 15mm. The next reason many people consider going down the 6mm path is they feel that painting up a 6mm force mix is easier than a 15mm force mix. This is certainly the case for ancients, as I do have 6mm ancient figures, and that's because of the way I base them. But I found with Napoleonics I spend almost as much time painting up an infantry element in 6mm than a 15mm element. And the reason is simple. I paint 4 figures for 15mm versus 12 figures for 6mm. It actually ends up being a lot harder, the 6mm path. Caveat, if you use smaller bases, then I agree, it's a lot easier to paint 6mm, and that's what I do with 6mm ancients, and that's why my 6mm ancient figures are so easy to whip up, or at least whipping up a force mix. 6mm is only marginally easier to paint, but not as much as you would expect, and whatever saving you get from 6mm is generally reduced when you then have to base the figures. I find basing 6mm figures more effort than 15mm figures if you're going to put 12 on an element. Caveat, if you use small bases, then the basing effort is the same. I'll have to admit, for me, or myself, I did not go down the 6mm path because it was cheaper or easier to paint. As it turned out, those benefits didn't really exist. I went down the 6mm path because I wanted to try a new basing system using, in this case, 3cm square bases, basically due to the rules I was using. Incidentally, I now feel this base size is probably better for 10mm figures than 6mm figures, unless you want the mass effect of 6mm figures. If you go down the mass effect, and that looks really good, the cost of a 6mm force mix will be very high, and the effort to paint it up and base it will even be higher than 15mm figures. But it is a viable path if you want to go down that particular path. I have to admit, it does look good if you want to paint up 1,000 figures. Back to my 3cm square basing. I'm uncertain if this new basing system will give me the benefits I'm hoping for, and that is something I'll only find out once I play more games. But I did have a solid reason to go down this particular basing path and put 6mm figures on it. For example, based on the rules I use, I saw little benefit going down the 6mm path for ancients, at least using 3cm square bases. Perhaps in the future I'll find a set of rules which will need a new base size, in which case I'll look at 6mm as a possible solution on a 3cm square. On the other hand, 6mm ancients on a 3cm wide, 1cm deep element works really well, and that's why I went down that path, simply because the rules favour that kind of basing. An example why selecting the rules up front is so important. It will affect the basing that you'll be implementing. Now let's move to purchasing the figures. The next step you need to consider is what you need to purchase. When I purchased my 6mm figures, I was uncertain what basing I was going to use, so I purchased more figures than I originally expected. If you do your research up front and lock down your basing, you won't get this problem. Originally I wanted to base my 6mm in this manner, 2 rows of 6 figures each with some skirmishes in front. The first problem I found was Bacchus provides the figures in nice strips of 4 figures. When I cut one strip in 2 and tried to fit 6 figures in a row, it was very tight and very difficult to base. The other issue was the effect I was trying to achieve, a diorama effect. With skirmishes in front, it did not work on bases as small as 3cm square. Certainly works on 6cm square bases, but I discovered when I experimented it doesn't work on this size of base. After asking a few of my gaming opponents, I finally came to this conclusion. My gaming camaraden suggested that each base would be better represented as a unit rather than, let's say, a part of a unit or a diorama. The other advantage is that if I base it in this manner, which looks kind of like a column, I have 3 ranks, which does actually feel right because most armies use 3 ranks, except for the British. I make no claim that this final layout is optimal, but for my 3cm square bases, it worked for me. The next issue I had to tackle was cavalry. My ancients were based in a single line of 2, 3 or 4 figures. I wanted to try and see if I could get 2 rows of 3 figures and discovered they did fit on a 3cm square. It seems Bacchus specifically designed their cavalry to fit on a base 1½ centimeters deep, unlike Heroic and Ross ancient cavalry figures, which kind of don't. Artillery was not an issue, and I placed a single gun on each base with 4 crew. The horse artillery also contained a horse figure, so I knew it was horse artillery. For Blucher, I used homemade movement trays. These trays were easily made with 3mm thick MDF sheets, cut as required with a handsaw, and with using 3mm square balsa strips, which are cut and glued as required. This shows my 4-slot tray with 2 spots which can hold dice to indicate elan and a spot for the formation name. When the enemy is unaware of the unit, this is placed face down in the slot and only flipped when the formation becomes known. As the actual figures have minimal game influence, I leave the figures in the slots sometimes and other times I do not. It depends on how serious I am during the game. The terrain these movement trains are on right now are not really designed for Blucher, or at least this movement tray size, as in that case all terrain features have to be as large as the movement tray to make sense. I do have other terrain features, but when I initially went down this path I didn't have the correct terrain set up for myself. So the key lesson here is if you're creating terrain and you're going down a 6cm square, the terrain pieces need to be increments of 6 centimeters. Now for the purchasing of the figures. After much consideration, the system I used was I needed 2 packets of heavy and 2 of light cavalry, which gave me too much cavalry, but did give me the all-important dragoons, cuirassiers, hussar and light cavalry. This gives me 8 elements of dragoons, 7 of cuirassiers, 6 of hussars and 6 of light cavalry. The remaining light cavalry figures were based 3 to a base to represent skirmishing cavalry. I also got a packet of lancers, which was overkill. For the artillery, which comes in packet of 4, I got 1 packet of 4-pounders, 1 packet of 12-pounders, and 1 packet of horse 6-pounders, and 2 packets of 6-pounders, and 2 packets of 8-pounders. This was a gross overkill, and all I really needed was 12 foot artillery and 4 horse artillery, but I just could not resist, and have as a result wasted lots of money. I base my command figures on 2cm and 3cm circles. The 2cm sub-commanders consist of 1 to 2 figures, and the CNC 3cm circle commander consisted of a tent and some officers. This only required one command packet. Moving to the infantry, I ended up purchasing 6 packets of infantry, which each could individually provide me with 8 elements. Some of the figures I've retasked as light infantry. I created light infantry elements using a combination of line infantry and appropriate skirmish figures, so I could identify them easily. As for the grenadiers, guards and skirmishers, more overkill occurred and I purchased far too many figures. My primary or theoretical objective was to create a number of corps. Each corps would consist of 6 line, 2 light and 1 or 2 artillery and 1 or 2 light cavalry. In addition, there were 3 skirmish elements. This was originally based on DBN, but seems to work well with most of the other rules that I currently use. The cavalry corps was the wild card. This varied a lot, but would typically consist of 2 cuirassiers, 4 dragoons, 1 light and 2 horse artillery elements. The guards and grenadiers were the most difficult and generally would number no more than half a dozen elements. Finally, army-level artillery would be added, 12-pounder artillery basically. I planned on creating a force mix of up to 6 infantry corps, 2 cavalry corps and 1 guard grenadier corps. This should have required no more than 120 elements, but as it turned out I ended up with almost 160 elements. The lesson to be learned is to carefully structure your force mix and try and control your buying impulses. There were some lessons I learnt in the whole exercise, that is, of identifying, purchasing, painting up and basing my French 6mm force mix, and the most important was to make sure the elements can easily be recognised. I found all my infantry kind of looked rather similar. I did paint the light infantry a different shade of blue, and they, with minimal effort, could easily be identified, but the grenadiers and guards were really hard to spot. The cavalry were much easier, and each type of cavalry being uniquely painted a unique colour. This shows a hussar element. The light infantry are in the first rank, followed by the line infantry in this particular image. The grenadiers have a nice white top, but I found it surprisingly difficult to spot. It would have been nice if the figures contained a flag bearer, which I could use to identify grenadiers and guards, something I'll have to consider when I do my Austrians. I also discovered the 6mm figures were not as photogenic as my 15mm figures when you came up close. Close up, and they didn't look really good, or they certainly didn't look anywhere as good as the 15mm, which I suppose is expected. But I must admit, if you pan back, they look good in mass. Just a quick note, all the pictures I've used in this video only come from one nationality, in this case French. At the time I originally created this video, I had yet to purchase an Austrian army, but that's been resolved and I've got it, but they have yet to be painted. The issue with dabbling in a new scale is often you do not have opponents, which means you do need to create 2 armies and get other gamers to give it a go before it can grow. With all the lessons I've learned, I will now repeat this process to create my opponent to the French force mix. All I need to complete is the painting and basing of my Austrians. I found the painting up of this force mix was a really big job, particularly for the French. It seems a lot harder than 15mm for some reason, probably because you just have to paint up so many different figures. Regardless, I just hope I've not wasted my time and money and effort with this particular project. A quick update with this second edition of this video. While I've selected a 3cm square base as my primary basing for Napoleonics, I've also decided to use a 3cm wide by 1cm deep base for infantry. In this case, what you can see here is my ancient force mix, which seems to work quite well. I'll be also basing up some Napoleonics in this manner to see how they work. As this base size was my original WRG Napoleon base size for 15mm back in the 1970s, I see no reason why it would not work for 6mm in the Napoleonic area. These rather small bases are placed into a 3cm square movement tray. This is mainly rules-based, with each movement tray representing a unit with 3 steps of losses in each unit. Cavalry and artillery are on a larger base, 1.5cm deep, so only 2 can be placed into this movement tray, and each of those units only have 2 steps. In the end, I realised basing does depend on the rules you use. Well, it's I realised that at the beginning, but it is very important at all stages of your force mix or your basing. And so we come to an end of episode 46 of my figure gaming hobby series of videos, in this case providing an overview of my new 6mm Napoleonic French force mix. Alle guten Dingen, kommen zu einem Ende.